Yeah, I mean, like this is the thing. It's like I'm here in Texas, and like it's been very worrying to watch this kind of rivalry between DeSantis and Greg Abbott. There's like a joke here, like amongst journalists, that like if you want to predict the future in Texas, you'd need to subscribe to the Miami Herald, right? Because it's basically they're both doing this kind of thing with each other, trying to see who can sort of like out right wing the other person. And I think what you're saying is exactly right, in the sense of like, yeah, these things might not be constitutional, these things might fail, but it's a win because they get to go up when they're both running for president and say like, I try to do these, red meat things for our base, and the broken court system or whatever prevented us from doing it. But like, I was curious, like specifically on this blogger journalist like registration thing, like what even is like the rationale that they're putting forward for people? Is it to stop like disinformation or to stop like dark money? I'm just curious like how they're even trying to sell this to people, because I don't know, like maybe I'm being too sympathetic to like conservatives, but even trying to understand that ideology, it feels like this is completely out of bounds for certain folks.
The free speech folks, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, where's Glenn Greenwald, right? Where's
Yeah,
the
we'll wait
lights?
for that. You never know.
You folks, let's build a coalition of unlikely allies here in defense of the First Amendment. No, they're never going to come. But so basically, what they're saying is that this is an election transparency issue, because what their rationale is that these bloggers, these journalists, are actually not journalists at all. They're paid advocates. You know what I mean? They're activists, and we deserve to know who funds them. But like advocacy journalism is protected under the First Amendment. There's no like journalism clause in the Constitution that says that it needs to be objective and nobody can. You know what I mean? It's just nonsense. Yeah. But again, it's what we're saying. They don't care, right? This is just about going after the fake news media and and whatever. And it's like Matt said, if it sticks, great. They went after the fake news media, and if it doesn't, then look at that. We're fighting the establishment at every turn we get.
It's wild how they'll make vehicles. Sometimes they make a vehicle out of free speech, and that's the vehicle for like saying, "Hey, we need to like attack scholarship of whiteness in this country." But they can easily jettison the free speech stuff in favor of, as they are in this case, like, ooh, election transparency and dark money. These bloggers, they're basically the head of dark money. It's like, well, maybe we should do some about PACs and like the actual real dark money spend before we go after like people who have Substack, supplementary income. Ridiculous.
Yeah, and actually, I wanted to touch on another bill, because you mentioned Texas and the rivalry between Abbott and DeSantis. So I'm sure you guys and a lot of people who listen to this podcast will remember the migrant flights to Martha's Vineyard last year. So there was a lot of controversy, obviously because of like the cruelty, the fact that they use these people as props. They gave them bad information about their asylum cases, possibly sabotaging them. But The Intercept and others had really, really good investigative pieces that showed that the company that was contracted to run those flights was actually a company that exclusively donated to Florida Republican campaigns, including Larry Keefe, who is Ron DeSantis's quote unquote safety czar, who designed the program. So there's law in Florida that you can't actually use state funds to basically have undocumented immigrants or transport undocumented immigrants to sanctuary jurisdictions, which is exactly what they did, right? There's been a bunch of different lawsuits to try to get an injunction, a freeze on the usage of that money, those tax dollars for these sorts of programs. So they actually called a special session before the beginning of the Florida legislative session, which is today, spending tens of thousands of dollars on a special session just so they could pass an actual bill that gave DeSantis $10 million to continue these migrant flights, and that basically rewrote the language of previous immigration bills, saying that they could actually move immigrants from anywhere in the United States to any other part of the United States, giving them, blank check, in terms of like, judicial liability. And the bill also included approval from the state legislature, not just on the usage of these $10 million that were now approved, but the usage of the money last year, basically avoiding an audit at the state level on how they used the money. And they can do all of this with no bids. So even if you approve the usage of this money for these flights, they don't have to bid for the best deal, in terms of, how much it's worth. So there's just, my point is, beyond the cruelty of just the actual fact of these migrant flights, right? What they did to these people, it is such an obvious grift that was used also as a kickback for their donors. And so much of Florida is that, right? There's just so much grifting going on.
Yeah, it's awful. I know in Bexar County in San Antonio, they're investigating some of those DeSantis people for human trafficking, and hopefully something comes out of that. But like, no, it's exceptionally dark, and like, there's lots of other examples of things like the Chinese citizens owning property. I know in Florida they're making a big deal about that. They're doing the same thing here. I don't know the population of Florida as well, but there's plenty of people here on green cards. There's a sizable like Chinese population here, where you're telling people who like might work, a job in the Houston area that they can't like buy a condominium, right? It's something very different than like the proposed argument that, we're trying to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from slowly taking over our area. But like, I'm curious, like, there's more bills I think we want to get to, but I'm just curious, from your perspective, somebody who's, in Florida, somebody who's been active, somebody who knows a lot of these things. What has happened in the state that has sort of like allowed Ron DeSantis to sort of get into this position of power, the dominance of the Republican Party in the state? Because like, it's a pretty significant trend for it. Not because, like in recent memory, Florida was sort of like, one of the more famous like purple states, and now like it very much feels like more of a Texas in the sense of like the Republicans dominating state level politics there.
So this is a big question.
Totally.
Bear with me here. But people, have to understand, and I think they are starting to understand that now. But Florida is the South. It's a southern state. You mentioned the fugitive slave laws, Matt. Like Jim Crow is a real part of Florida history, and it's still with us today. When you go to Tallahassee and you walk inside the Florida Capitol, it's a good old boys club. It's very, very white and very, very southern, and it sure feels that way. So, another thing is, yeah, Florida was a purple state and it was more competitive, and maybe it can be in the future, but it has been controlled by the Republican Party since the late 90s, right? So they've had a clear majorities, not super majorities. That's a recent development, but they've had clear majorities in the state legislative chambers. They've controlled the governorship and most of the positions in the executive cabinet. The Democratic Party here, traditionally, historically, it was very, very powerful, right? All the way up until the turn of the millennium. But it was a Dixiecrat party, right? It was a Southern Democrat party that, with the shifts in like the political alliances and sentiment from the 1960s and the Civil Rights Act and the realignment, it gradually lost power until, it was just decapitated in the early 2000s. And they've just, they haven't been able to build a competent organization. They haven't been able to build good infrastructure, aside from when Obama won the state twice. But that was more about Obama as a candidate and his national operation than the Florida Democratic Party. Another thing is that the Florida Democratic Party is a corporatist party. I'm involved with them, and I'll tell you, they have a list of corporations like Florida Power and Light, like Big Sugar, U.S. Crystals, that they can't really attack in press conferences or press releases because they're donors to the party. And if you go to the annual gala, you can see all these companies are in their little booklet of donors, right? So they are a pay for play. They're controlled opposition. Another factor that I think is really, really important here is that Florida is extremely right-wing in terms of its diasporas, right? I'm from Argentina. So when I went to vote at the consulate, and I voted for Fernandez, right? I voted for the Peronista, Alberto Fernandez, Cristina Kirchner as the vice president. I went and I voted for the center-left party. Like, I think like 92% of the people of Argentinians in Miami voted for Macri, who was the neoliberal right-wing candidate. And it sure felt that way when I was at the consulate. I think like 96% of Brazilians recently voted for Bolsonaro. You know what I mean? The Cubans tend to be very, very right wing. The Venezuelans, the Colombians, when in the recent elections on the runoff between Rodolfo and Petro, overwhelmingly voted for Rodolfo Hernandez. So you have just very, very right wing immigrants that come here, unlike the Hispanics from the Southwest, right, which tend to be more Mexican. And that's where Bernie did really well. I worked in the Bernie campaign in 2020, and we absolutely crushed it in Nevada and California. We did pretty well in Texas. In Florida, we lost by 40 points, remember? Because they have this sort of like anti-communist, anti-socialist sentiment to them. And then the last thing I'll say is that there was a real realignment with the COVID era, right? I think the Republican Party of Florida and Ron DeSantis were able to like really seize this like, free Florida mantra and like ingrain it into people. I remember I saw him do a press conference during the early COVID days, and he said something like, the Zoom class wants to keep you locked in your home while they have their little cushy remote jobs. And I was like, that's dangerous. That's some real like pandemic populism right there. And then, they're making the place unaffordable, right? Like we have now the most expensive like rental and housing markets in the country, and, higher inflation than anywhere else in the country. So people are starting to move out, and retirees, like asshole, like New Yorkers and people, like boomers from the Midwest are moving in. And those people aren't voting Democrat, and they're not voting progressive. They're voting Republican. So you're starting to see like, a demographic change that's not necessarily working in our favor. So I think all of these things, and there's I'm sure there's things that I've missed as well, but all of these ingredients are creating a stew for these sort of like extremist, right-wing politics that like bucked the national trend both in 2020 and 2022, right? I mean, the Democrats, can criticize them all you want, but they had a pretty good midterm election, right? I mean, they defied expectations, except in Florida.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit like that, the Florida stuff, because if you want to comment on "Don't Say Gay" or the "Stop Woke," like these sorts of bills, but broadly, like I'm curious how is are the Florida Republicans, are they post-Trump? Because the COVID stuff is interesting to me. Like they're both trying to irresponsible each other on COVID, even though they both took measures. Like Trump will be like, well, he closed the beaches for a while, and Trump himself like was in charge of warp speed and the vaccine stuff. And they don't, of course, they're not going to take credit for that. I'm just curious, like that angle. Let's talk about Trump and that side of it. Like, are the legislature, are they like lining up behind DeSantis now?
So that's an interesting question. The Republican Party of Florida just had its elections for leadership, right? They elected a new chair, and the election was largely seen as a proxy war between the DeSantis camp, who ran this guy named Evan Power, who's a real shithead from Leon County, which is up north. He's the chair of Leon County, and Christian Siegler, who is the vice chair of the Republican Party of Florida. Another shithead. He was actually he filmed himself during the January 6th riots. So that's the Republican Party of Florida. So Evan Powers was a DeSantis guy through and through, and Siegler was part of the Trump camp, right? And actually, the guy that won was Siegler, and Trump did not like. He as usual, he wasn't, subtle. He definitely took the opportunity to get some digs at DeSantis. He put out like a statement saying that the Republican Party of Florida proved that, they stand behind Trump and his campaign for president, and Siegler's his man. So I think, yes, the legislature, and it's not like Ziegler is going to go out and, fight DeSantis or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a lot of hesitancy to go after Trump. They know that he is the top dog. And something recent that happened too, that really illustrates these sort of proxy battles, is that in this legislation, that the anti-immigrant legislation that we started this podcast with, there was also supposed to be a provision that they could add, but as of now it's not there, to strip in-state tuition for undocumented students. That's basically, if you don't know, it allows undocumented students to pay at the same rate as U.S. citizen students. I actually, when I was undocumented, I couldn't go to the university because it was so expensive to pay as a foreign student. So this is something that's really important to me because, I lived it. DeSantis initially proposed including stripping in-state tuition in this law, and it's not there. When DeSantis came out with the proposal, Rick Scott, who actually signed the in-state tuition law in 2014 during, remember when the Republicans were trying to be more pro-immigrant before Trump, but after the Obama 2012 defeat,
Right.
Rick Scott came out that same day when DeSantis proposed stripping this away and said that he completely opposed doing this, and that he would sign the law to give in-state tuition to undocumented kids today if he could, and that he thought it was the wrong thing to do. Now, if you ask me, I don't think Rick Scott did this because he's, seeing, his better angels. It's
Right.
because it was an opportunity to take a dig at DeSantis, and Rick Scott is a Trump guy through and through. He goes after Mitch McConnell, he goes after DeSantis, and they know that attacking this like the DACA Dreamer undocumented students is not the most popular thing to do in terms of anti-immigrant legislation. Not that Trump wouldn't, right? But you have to look at these sort of things and who's attacking who, and there's always an ulterior motive, and there's always like politics involved.
No, I mean, I think these proxy battles are are really interesting because, just like cross-state like comparisons and things like that. Like DeSantis is holding a lot of sway with elected Republicans right now here. Like, I think there are a lot of people in the Texas ledge who are sort of taking cues from what DeSantis is up to. Certainly Abbott's doing it, but Abbott's doing it like in opposition to him. You know what I mean? While I think some people in the Texas ledge are sort of seeing this move, and I think it's important to sort of make a distinction between like the base of the Republican Party in the sense of the voters, and then Republican politicians and candidates, right? Because I mean, I'm curious what you think in Florida, because obviously it's DeSantis' home state, but I still do think that like Trump has like the Republican voter base like in the bag. But I think that there's a very clear opportunity right now for the Republican Party, which doesn't want to have to deal with the Trump stuff, sort of trumping it, doing whatever he wants and not always listening to the best wishes of the party, trying to sort of make it seem like DeSantis is like, the next coming of Trump. So I think like there's a lot of support for him within like the Republican Party in the sense of like officials and members of like county level Republican stuff like that. But I'm curious, like in Florida, if you think that there's, like obviously, like, I think DeSantis would have a unique advantage there that like he might not have in other states when it comes to voters.
Well, so there. I don't know if you guys saw this. It was circulating on Twitter. I actually tweeted it because it was so funny. But Brian Kilmeade was in a Florida diner recently. I think it was in Vero Beach, and he was like running around, basically trying to find a DeSantis supporter. Like literally asking, "Are you excited for Ron DeSantis?" And like every single person was like, "Nah, I'm with Trump all the way." And he found a woman with a DeSantis T-shirt. And he goes up to the woman, and the woman was like, I actually kind of like Nikki Haley, but if it comes down to it, I'm gonna vote Trump. So like he couldn't find a single DeSantis. Wow. I mean, obviously this is anecdotal. The things, I don't know. I'm not really a pundit, right? And I don't know how to predict it. But what I do think is that DeSantis is a fucking nerd. He's a fucking nerd. He's a loser. His voice is whiny. I mean, I'm not trying to flip it, right? Like, he does not have charisma. He's short, which I'm sorry, like in American presidential politics, like it matters if your opponent is 6'4" and you're 5'8".
Yeah, which Trump is 6'4". Trump's a tall guy.
Yeah, so I don't know, man. I think like if they're in that debate stage and he calls them like Tiny D or Meatball Ron, and DeSantis, responds with his like whiny little voice, I just don't see it, man. But I could be wrong.
No, I mean, totally. A couple weeks back, we had Luke Savage on the show, and we played a little video of like Ron DeSantis' response to some of Trump's barbs in the media, and he's just like, "I don't want to attack Republicans. I want to build this report."
Yeah.
It's like, "Oh, you're gonna get smoked, man."
Yeah.
But as like the president, sorry,
bro, like the first thing that Trump ever did on the first presidential debate that he ever was is they asked him, will you support anybody else on the stage if they win the nomination? And he was like, nah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm gonna win. And you know what? It was kind of fucking epic, and people loved it. And like, really, like your response to being attacked is gonna be, well, I don't attack all the Republican candidates. Dude, like, I'm sorry, like you sound like a pussy. Like it's not gonna go well with your electorate.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think totally. It's in. I mean, I know we've made this point a bunch, Matt, but I think you might be interested in hearing this, Thomas. That there is a very weird like AstroTurf DeSantis thing that goes on too. Like whenever we do DeSantis content on this channel, we'll just get like a plethora of like pro DeSantis like commenters, right? And like like maybe it's anecdotal, maybe they are just like people who regularly are tuning into like our show to defend Ron DeSantis, but something smells a little off to me when it's so orchestrated in a way that like it's noticeable to me in the analytics that like doing anything on DeSantis like blows up and gets like a lot of engagement from people saying that they really really like him. I've had serious doubts about like the actual grassroots capacity of his presidential run. But I'm curious, like, because this happened with Beto here, in sort of the opposite way, where when Beto ran for president, he lost a lot of favor with Democratic voters in the state of Texas, right? Because they were like, you were supposed to be fighting for us, and then you seem to be much more interested in being in Iowa or like going and doing a presidential campaign. Do you have some sense that like, because it's very clear that DeSantis is priming himself for, and he was just here in Texas recently, giving a big speech. He's going around the country trying to become more of a national figure. Do you think that there might be some kind of frustration in Florida that might come out of him, sort of touring the country and maybe not being as focused on the state of Florida?
Look, I don't know because the Floridians are very culturally different than Texans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can see that the Texan character being more offended than the Floridian. The Floridian, yeah, it's hard. It's hard for me to say, honestly. What I will say is that again, I think at the end of the day, Trump is has that advantage built out for him, right? That he can say, "Look, I'm not abandoning my post,"
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, and he's going to hit him on that. He's going to say, look, I made you. You came to me crying for an endorsement. You had an advertisement teaching your kid. Did you guys see that ad where he taught his toddler how to build a wall?
Yeah.
Yeah. You had a campaign ad with your baby reading him my book, The Art of the Deal. You came crying to me for an endorsement. You got the job, and now you're abandoning it. Mm-hmm. So I could see that line of attack being used against them, and I could see it being effective for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he's poor. He's poorer than me. Thomas Kennedy, host of Why Are We Like This, at TOMASKENN on Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us once again, Thomas.
No, and thank you guys for giving some coverage to what's happening in the state, because it's really bad, and it could be spread nationwide. And I always tell people, if you're not careful, the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. So,
yeah, and without the weather, which is even worse. Thanks, Thomas.